Good morning. Well, I guess it's good morning here anyway, where I am. But my day here is class is to give you a little information about one of Poe's, I guess, most popular stories. Also, one of his shortest stories, by the way, called The Telltale Heart, um, which obviously you've been assigned to read. Probably what you're going to find is that the story probably, in some ways, is Poe's most perfect story. It's got all the characteristics of a classic Poe story, and it's really written in a way that's not quite as ornate, not quite as, should we say, rich and embellished with a lot of literary symbols and cultural allusions as some of the others. Just a tense, straightforward narrative um, about the planning of a murder. It's carried out very methodically, very precisely. Uh, what makes it a Poe story? Well, of course, there's the unreliable narrator. We get a lot of Poe stories, right? And I think this one is more unreliable than probably any in Poe. There's a lot of those. Of course, told in the first person from the standpoint of the narrator. Get the narrator's view of the story. And right off the bat, the narrator says, yeah, true, very, very nervous. I have been and continue to be, but would you say that I'm mad? And of course, narrator keeps asking that rhetorical question throughout the piece. And of course, the more you read, the more you realize that, yes, he truly is mad, obsessed, mad. He's having a breakdown, probable psychotic break with reality. And you just see the growing psychosis and the danger that it poses to the only other person in this story, which is an old man. So, but that's one of the classic lines to start any Poe story. True, true, very nervous. I have been and continue to be. But would you say that I'm mad? And of course, someone who is truly mad or insane doesn't think he or she is mad. Of course, to them, the reality they see is the reality. It's not the different reality, whereas in reality it is, of course. But anyway, so you got that. The classic unreliable narrator. Setting for this story. Well, it takes place in an apartment somewhere, we think in a city. Not sure really. We think it's the home, is the place, is the location, the home of an old man who is being cared for by, we assume, a much younger man who is the caretaker and the person or the character who is telling our story here. As far as the time frame of this classic of psychological terror and obsession, covers about 8 days, like a whole week. It's also true that most of the action takes place around midnight, the bewitching hour, and I don't think that was coincidental with Poe. He meant it to be that way. Midnight, the witching hour, clock strikes midnight, everything you ever heard about midnight, and unusual things tend to take place. So you have that. We were talking about the characters in the story. You got the nameless narrator, the unreliable one, of course. You've got the old man, and eventually you have some police who enter near the end of the story. Just kind of peripheral characters. It's basically the old man and the presumably young man. Don't forget, too, that Poe likes to dabble in doubles or opposites. Saw it in the fall of the House of Usher. Madeline and Roderick Usher are twins, siblings alike in every way. Um, you've seen it in other stories. In Ligeia, you have the Lady Ligeia. She dies, but then ultimately is reborn in another woman's body. Her name was Lady Rowena. Sorry, my cat's trying to get up on my desk and around my computer. I don't know why she's so um, distracted this time of morning. I think she was outside earlier and saw another cat, and I had to bring her in to keep them from getting into it because my cat is she's you know she can be a little testy at times, very territorial. Will definitely defend her turf, so to speak. Anyway, but back to the thing. Um, I would have to say, of course, the protagonist becomes the true focus of the tale. Now, we assume that the narrator telling the story, truly nervous I had been and continue to be, but why would you think I'm mad? We're assuming to be a male, although it never really says. No specific gender is actually given. Uses only I and me, Poe does, in reference to the character. We just assume it's a male because you got a male author using the first person point of view. Therefore, there's no reason why you couldn't possibly be dealing with a deranged protagonist as a woman. Now there's some acts of strength that take place in this, but I think a woman could pull that off, particularly a strong young woman against an old feeble man, for sure. But anyway, um, we're not sure about that as far as the narration goes, as far as the gender of the narrator. Of course, point of view, POV, Poe writes the story from the perspective of the murderer of the old man. And of course, um, that is the whole thing. And when POV is used, first person point of view often creates a situation in a story where the sense of the impact of the story is heightened, it's more dramatic. The person telling the story is also involved in the story in some specific way. I think the narrator here adds to the effect of the horror or of the suspense by continually stressing to the reader that he or she is not mad, tries to convince us by the fact of how carefully the crime, the brutal crime here, is planned and executed very painstakingly over a period of a little more than a week. Interpretation of the story, well, I think it's fairly forthright. You have a deranged person who seizes upon one particular aspect of another person. The obsession with that aspect develops and becomes more and more irrational, eventually leading to a brutal murder, essentially. Um, it's a case of domestic violence that occurs as a result of an irrational fear. The fear here, and you see this in a lot of Poe's stories, a lot of his narrators and characters are afraid of being locked up, afraid of being buried prematurely, buried alive, afraid of being tossed into a pit, some enclosed area, whatever the case may be. It's just throughout Poe. But here, the fear is the old man's eye, his eye, actually. Narrator describes the eye of this old man as being pale blue with a film over it, okay? Resembling a vulture. Looks like a vulture eye. Now, is there reason for him to fear the old man's eye? Not really. Well, not rationally anyway. But this phobia or this fear of the old man's eye seems to evoke the dark side in the narrator, and eventually drives him to madness and to an act of brutal murder. On the other hand, I've often said this to classes in which I've taught this story. Could Poe, the author, be referring to this belief whose origins really go back to ancient Greece and Rome? I'm going to read a few thoughts from a critical analysis about this this possibility of the obsession with the evil eye from a piece by Martha Womack, who is a blogger, has a internet identity known as Precisely Poe, and often writes about themes Edgar Allan Poe. So I would say she's somewhat of a scholar, at least one with some academic credentials, and I really have to really think I do agree with some of her points. But the point is, and this is directly from one of Womack's blogs, I'm quoting here. The belief in the evil eye dates back to ancient times, and even today is fairly common in India and the countries bordering the Mediterranean Sea. References are made to it in Jewish, Islamic, Buddhist, and Hindu faiths. The belief centers around the idea that those who possess the evil eye have the power to harm people or their possessions by merely looking at them. And that's essentially what the old man does. A few moments during some of their nightly sojourns where the narrator peeks into the bedroom of the old man and shines a tiny light upon the old man. The old man is awakened and he sees the eye looking directly back at him. Belief centers around the idea that those who possess the evil eye have the power to harm people or their possessions by merely looking at them. Wherever this belief exists, it is common to assign the evil eye as the cause of unexplainable illnesses and misfortunes of any kind. To continue, to protect oneself from the power of the eye, certain measures can be taken. In Muslim areas, the color blue is painted on the shutters of the houses and found on beads worn by both children and animals. There's also a specific hand gesture named the Hand of Fatima, named after the daughter of Muhammad. This name is also given to an amulet in the shape of a hand that is worn around the neck for protection. In some locations, certain phrases such as God will or God bless it are uttered to protect the individual from harm. In extreme cases, the eye, whether voluntary or not, must be destroyed. One Slavic folktale relates the story of the father who blinded himself for fear of harming his own children with his evil eye. But continuing from Womack, would Poe have had knowledge of this rather strange belief? It is altogether possible that he would have, which creates another interesting twist to his story. Maybe the narrator who tries to convince us that madness is not really the issue is telling the truth. Maybe this vile act is necessary in order to destroy the power of the old man's evil eye. Could be. We don't know for sure. It's speculation, but there you have it. At least there's some reason to believe, based on history, that there was this thing about the evil eye that was considered harmful or dangerous and had to be cast out. Just like the Dracula myth, people would protect themselves from the curse of the vampire by wearing a cross or other things. Wolfbane, protect oneself from the werewolf's attack. That sort of thing. So I just throw that out there, and I think it's reasonable. You can certainly write an essay about it without question. Theme of the story. You could definitely look at this from a Freudian or psychological standpoint. Um, Delicate balance between good and evil in our natures, the fact that we have a dark side, and every human personality sometimes is a delicate balance between our evil side or our dark side and our angelic or our good side. Sometimes that balance is upset and the dark side can take over. And it's essentially is could be what is happening in this story. Just like in Freudian psychology, there are three areas of the mind. There's the ego, which is our connection to reality, the way we see the world. There's the superego, which of course represents our moral sense of right and wrong, making judgments, moral evaluations. But then there's that hidden area, the unconscious mind, which I think Freud called the id, which represents all our primal desires, our violent side, sexual impulse, other powerful urges and instinctive feelings for power, lust, again, sexuality. The id wants what it wants. It's that uncontrolled part of the mind that usually comes to fore in our dreams, right? And Freud read extensively about trying to map the dreamscape of the times when we're asleep. But there is this dark side in us. In this story, the dark side emerges. And this caretaker, this narrator, this man who's caring for a much older person, and something pushes him over the edge. Perhaps he was already there. It's certainly his obsession with the old man and the eye that he keeps looking at night after night. Is the thing that finally separates him from his reason. The vulture eye makes the narrator's blood run cold when he sees it in the dark. This irrational fear evokes the dark side in the narrator and leads to murder. Of course, he plans, he executes the crime, I think on the eighth night. He finally jumps in, murders the old man by suffocating him with a mattress and pillow. Of course, the old man had been awake night after night, sensing that someone was watching him. The narrator had a lantern which he would open just a tad, just enough to see the old man's eye there, the old man watching him, wondering, fearful. But anyway, once he finally executes the plan after thinking about it night after night, and he quickly gets it over with, smothers the old man, dismembers his body, which is fairly gruesome, and buries it underneath the planks of the apartment in one of the rooms. Another indication of the narrator's obsession and his break with reality or losing of his grasp on reality would be the fact, he speaks about his heightened senses. We see this in a lot of Poe stories. For instance, in The Fall of the House of Usher, Roderick Usher is very sensitive to certain sounds. They drive him insane. Smells, he's very sensitive to certain things. The only sound he could really stand is the sound of a violin or certain stringed instruments. Of course, he's the one who first hears the struggling of his sister. Well, I guess it's his sister or his sister's body or his sister's resurrection, or if you want to think in vampiric terms, his sister struggling to get out of the closed coffin, running her fingers over the coffin, pushing, shoving, groaning. So he hears this. And the same is true of the narrator in this story, The Telltale Heart. This sense of hearing. Here's a quote from the story: this heightened sense of the auditory hallucination And of course, psychotic people often do hear things that the rest of us do not hear, or see things that others do not hear. But he says, the narrator does. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. So, of course, the narrator insisting continually that he's not mad. However, the reader soon realizes that the fear of the vulture eye has overcome the narrator, who has now become a victim to the madness which he had hoped to elude. And of course, you ultimately, once the police come to investigate, everything appears fine. Neighbor thought she heard a cry one night around midnight, and that was the moment of the murder, as the old man briefly struggled against the murderer who suffocated the old man. But then, of course, those last couple of scenes where the police come in, they seem to be talking just normally, police asking questions. It appears that they have no reason to suspect him. The narrator tells the police the old man had gone away for a while. The scream was nothing to worry about. It was an alley cat or something of that nature. And he appears completely calm, and he's going to get over it. But of course, the sounds that have been plaguing him, he says he even hears sounds in hell, really starts to come back on him, doesn't it? He begins to hear this thump, ka-thump, ka-thump. And it gets louder and louder as he's talking to the police. He tries to make niceties and talk about the weather or whatever, but the thump, ka-thump of the heart, he thinks it's a heart anyway. And he describes it very distinctly, like the tick-tock of a clock through cotton, somewhat suppressed, but you can still hear it. And then, of course, ultimately, it begins to drive him crazy. It gets so loud, and he's hearing it, and he's hearing it. And so eventually, he's driven to an absolute breakdown and confesses his crime and breaks open the boards. There lies the beating of the old man's heart. Well, was it guilt who finally forced the narrator to confess the crime? Or was it an auditory hallucination? Of course, it had to be, because he had killed the old man and dismembered his body. But call it guilt, call it poetic justice, whatever you will. But finally, all the narrator's carefully controlled sense of himself dissolves and collapses, and he admits the murder. End of story. A couple other things. Notice the first sentence really creates a suspense. True, very nervous I have been and continue to be. And Poe, the writer of the story, goes on to talk about time throughout the story. Time going slowly, time going fast. It's very slowly, and when the narrator is stalking his victim, but it goes very fast during the time when the police come to investigate. The time is mentioned often, and the pace of the story often changes from very slow, methodically, to the end. It's just speeded up very quickly. Also get a lot of repetition of words in this story. Words like very, very slowly, repeating certain words and phrases. So check for that. Poe also uses noise to create atmosphere in the story. This focus on sound, the narrator says, I heard many things in hell, which would, that's kind of scary in and of itself. But a madman would hear things that could only come from hell, at least in his own mind. There's a lot of spooky noise in this old house, particularly late at night. There's these things called death beetles in the boards, the walls, that kind of that create this little mating sound. twitch, twitch kind of thing. And death beetles, of course, could be an illusion or a kind of symbol of death. It does take place here. A lot of descriptive imagery and the story, the way that Poe makes blue with a kind of a foggy film over it, looking like a vulture eye. The death sound, the rattle of the beetles in the walls of the apartment. So that's some of the things that Poe uses, the devices he uses to create atmosphere, suspense in this particular story, which I've always thought was really, it's shorter. It doesn't have the rich detail of language and digressions that we get in other stories like Ligeia and The Fall of the House of Usher. It's just straight narrative. The writer Poe is completely under control here, building up to slowly, methodically building up to the act of murder itself, and then the aftermath of that. As I ask you to do, to go to Blackboard and to watch Vincent Price's acting and recitation of the story of the Telltale Heart. It's in two parts. Part one's about 5 minutes. Part two is about 9 minutes. Of course, Vincent Price was one of the great horror movie, sci-fi movie actors of the 50s and 60s. And he was also one of the favorite actors of a director by the name of Roger Corman, who had an obsession with Poe himself and adapted, I think, 8 either stories or poems of Poe's into films. Now, they weren't what you would call high art, but they're kind of fun to watch. Some of them are so bad they're good. But some of the interpretations of Poe through Corman's films are fairly straightforward in a sense. But Price was great because he was tall, about 6'3", 6'4". He had these striking features. He had the voice that was perfect to play these obsessed and unbalanced narrators in Poe. And he does a great job with this particular story, The Telltale Heart, telling it in first person. The setting of the video is a prison cell, presumably after the narrator has been, of course, arrested by the police after he confessed to the murder of the old man and showed them his dismembered body parts. And so as the video opens, the narrator is in jail alone. And this is where he begins to tell the story. True, very nervous, and goes on to tell the entire story. It's only about 15 minutes long because the story is one of the shortest in the Poe catalog. But it's a fun story, really the favorite of a lot of people. It's definitely one of my favorites. I also liked Ligeia and Usher and others, The Pit and the Pendulum, which we didn't read, but for just sheer execution and brevity and control, this may be one of the best stories in the entire Poe canon. Okay, well, guys, enjoy The Telltale Heart.